Welcome back to Family Drama Stories. Every story on this channel is fictional, written to explore how favoritism and betrayal can quietly destroy a family from the inside, and what happens when the truth finally comes out. Today's story is about a woman who was forced to give up everything she was owed, only to build something her family could never have imagined. Her mother said it out loud, right at the Thanksgiving table. "There's no way you built a company worth this much." Tracy didn't even blink. She looked her mother dead in the eye and said, "I've been waiting for this moment since you made me sign away my inheritance." The room went silent. Tracy Bennett was 28 years old, living a quiet life just outside Lancaster, Pennsylvania, when that sentence finally left her mouth. A sentence she had been holding on to for almost a decade. Before we get into what really happened that night, and what led up to it, let me know. What time is it where you're watching this? And what city are you in? I love seeing how far these stories travel. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, or watched someone else get everything you worked for, you're going to want to stay until the end of this one. Drop a comment and let me know. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe so you don't miss what Tracy did next. Because the real story didn't start at that dinner table. It started years earlier, the day her family quietly decided which one of their children actually mattered. Years before that Thanksgiving table turned silent, Tracy Bennett was 9 years old in a narrow 2-story house on the edge of Lancaster. And the rules of that house were already written, even if nobody ever said them out loud. Her father, Howard Bennett, had spent over 20 years running Bennett Hardware, a small family store his own father had started, while her mother, Sandra, kept the books in a back office that smelled like coffee and old receipts. Howard worked the floor every day, 6 days a week, restocking shelves and talking customers through every drill bit and paint color, while Sandra handled the money, the suppliers, and the one conversation that never seemed to end: what would happen to the store once Howard got too old to run it? To Sandra, the answer had never been a real question. Kyle would take over. Kyle would keep the Bennett name above the door. Tracy, in her mother's words, would find a husband and have her own life to worry about, as if a wedding ring made a person disappear from her own family's plans before she'd even finished middle school. Tracy spent more afternoons behind that counter than Kyle ever did. She learned to run the register at 11, restocked shelves every weekend through high school, balanced the cash drawer when her mother was busy, and covered shifts whenever a part-timer called in sick, all without being asked twice. Kyle drifted in and out of the store, more interested in his friends and his car than in inventory sheets, and somehow that never seemed to count against him. None of Tracy's effort changed the one fact that sat underneath every family conversation about the future. Her name was never written anywhere near it. When the store's accountant once asked, almost as a joke, whether the daughter might want to learn the books too, Sandra answered before Tracy could even open her mouth, saying there wasn't much point training someone who'd be starting a family of her own soon enough. Tracy was 17 at the time, hadn't seriously dated anyone in her life, and had never once said out loud that she planned to leave Lancaster or hand her future over to a husband nobody had even met yet. She noticed the pattern long before she had the words for it, in the way her father introduced Kyle to suppliers as the next Bennett, while Tracy got a polite nod and nothing more, even on the days she'd worked a full shift before school started. One Sunday afternoon, with the whole family gathered at the kitchen table over meatloaf and green beans, Howard set his coffee down and said it plainly, the way he announced anything he already considered settled. The store would go to Kyle when the time came. No debate needed. No other name on the table. No vote taken from anyone sitting there. Tracy was 16, close enough to reach across and touch her father's arm, and still nobody turned to ask what she thought about any of it. She didn't argue that day. She just watched her mother nod along, like the decision had been hers from the start, and watched Kyle barely glance up from his phone, as if being handed an entire family business was no different from being handed the last slice of pie. That kind of certainty has a way of making people careless about everything else going on around them. And within the year, Howard Bennett's plans for that store would be forced to change far sooner, and far more permanently, than anyone sitting at that table was prepared for. The shock that hit the Bennett family came faster and harder than anyone in that house could have braced for. On a wet Tuesday evening, Howard was driving the store's delivery van back from a job site, a load of lumber strapped down for a customer who'd called in a rush order, when another driver ran a red light at the intersection 2 blocks from Bennett Hardware. Howard never made it to the hospital. He was 54 years old, and the man who had spent 2 decades behind that counter was gone before Sandra even finished driving across town to meet the ambulance. The store stayed closed for 11 days, the longest it had ever been shut since Howard's own father opened it, and when it finally reopened, nobody behind that counter knew how to run it the way Howard had. Orders piled up. 2 longtime suppliers called asking about overdue invoices Howard had always handled by memory, with no notes left behind for anyone to find. Regular customers started asking, carefully, whether Bennett Hardware would even stay open through the winter, and Sandra answered every one of them with a confidence she didn't actually feel. At home, that confidence cracked. Sandra, who had managed the books for years but never the actual business, started losing sleep over numbers that no longer added up the way they used to, staying up past midnight at the kitchen table with a calculator and a stack of unpaid invoices, terrified that one wrong decision would cost the family the only thing Howard had ever built. Within a month, she was meeting with the family's longtime attorney, a man named Gerald Foss who had handled Howard's will, twice a week instead of twice a year. It was in one of those meetings that the word inheritance came up out loud for the first time in front of anyone outside that office. Sandra wanted the store's ownership settled cleanly. Her words, before things got messier than they already were, and settling it cleanly meant deciding, on paper, who actually owned what Howard had spent his life building. Kyle, barely 20 and with no more experience running a register than restocking shelves on weekends, was suddenly being introduced to vendors as the future owner of Bennett Hardware, sitting in on meetings about loans and supplier contracts he didn't fully understand, nodding along to terms he'd never had to learn because Sandra was always there beside him filling in the gaps. Within weeks, his name was added to the store's business account and listed on new supplier paperwork as the point of contact going forward, despite the fact that he still couldn't close out the register without help. Tracy, who had worked more hours behind that counter over the years than Kyle ever had, wasn't invited to a single one of those meetings. She found out about most of them after they'd already happened, secondhand, from things her mother mentioned in passing at dinner, never as news that concerned her, only as updates she happened to overhear. One night, coming downstairs for a glass of water, long after she thought everyone had gone to bed, Tracy stopped just short of the living room when she heard her mother's voice through a door, left open a few inches, low and businesslike, talking to Gerald Foss on the phone about paperwork that needed to be ready before the end of the month. She caught only pieces of it. Something about Tracy's name needing to be removed from any future claim. Something about protecting Kyle's position once everything was finalized. And her mother's voice agreeing to all of it, without a single pause for argument. Tracy stood there in the dark hallway longer than she should have, her glass of water forgotten in her hand, replaying what she'd just heard, until it stopped making sense, and started feeling like something she wasn't supposed to know yet. She didn't say anything about it the next morning. A few weeks later, her mother called her into the living room, and from the second Tracy saw the folder already sitting open on the coffee table, she understood this wasn't going to be a conversation. It was going to be a signature. The papers were already sitting on the coffee table by the time Tracy walked into the living room, squared off neatly next to a pen that looked like it had been placed there on purpose. Gerald Foss sat in the armchair near the window, a leather folder open across his knees, and Sandra stood by the fireplace with her arms crossed. the way she always stood when she'd already decided how a conversation was going to end. Kyle was there too, leaning against the doorway with his hands in his pockets, not saying a word. Sandra didn't waste time on small talk. She told Tracy to sit down, then explained, in the same flat tone she used for grocery lists, that it made the most sense for the store to belong fully to Kyle. Free and clear, with no shared ownership and no future complications. Tracy asked why complications were suddenly the problem when nobody had ever asked her if she even wanted a share of the store in the first place. Sandra didn't blink. She said Tracy would get married eventually, start her own household, and a business tied up in a divorce or some future husband's debts was a risk nobody in this family needed. Kyle would keep the Bennett name on it, the way your father always wanted, she added, even though Tracy had heard her father say those exact words only once, at a kitchen table, to a room that never asked her opinion either. Tracy looked at the papers and said she wasn't signing anything until someone explained what she'd actually get out of it, since apparently she was being asked to give something up. Sandra's expression didn't change. She said this wasn't a negotiation, that the decision about the store had already been made weeks ago, and that Tracy was only being shown the paperwork now as a courtesy. Tracy asked when exactly that decision had been made, and who had been in the room for it, already knowing the answer before her mother said it. Everyone who needed to be, Sandra said. Gerald cleared his throat and slid a separate single page across the table, calling it a side agreement, nothing related to the store itself. Sandra said it plainly. If Tracy signed away her claim to Bennett Hardware, Sandra would cover her tuition in full for all 4 years of college. No loans. No working through school. Paid directly to the university every semester. Tracy looked over at Kyle, waiting for him to say something. Anything. About how unfair it was that he was getting handed an entire business, while his sister was being asked to trade her name off a deed for a tuition check. Kyle stared at the floor and said nothing. He didn't argue for her. He didn't argue against it either. He just stood there, quiet, like a person watching a transaction that had nothing to do with him, even though every part of it had everything to do with him. For a second, Tracy almost expected him to say something. Anything. Just to prove he'd noticed what was happening to her. He didn't. And that silence told her more about where she stood in this family than anything her mother had said all afternoon. Tracy felt something settle in her chest in that silence, colder than anything her mother had said out loud. She read through the document twice, her hands steady even though nothing inside her felt steady at all, and asked one more time whether there was any other way to handle this that didn't involve her signing away rights to something she'd spent years helping to run. Sandra said this was the only way. Final. Not up for more discussion. And slid the pen a few inches closer across the table. Tracy was 19, 3 weeks out from her first semester of college, with a tuition bill already sitting unpaid on her desk upstairs and no savings account that could touch it. She didn't sign that page because she believed her mother's promise. She signed it because the room had made it clear there was no version of that afternoon where she walked out without putting her name on something. The pen scratched against the paper longer than it needed to, and nobody in that room said another word until Gerald slid the signed page back into his folder and thanked her, like she'd just done something routine. The tuition checks arrived on schedule that first semester, exactly as promised, landing in the university's account 2 weeks before classes started. That promise held for exactly 1 term. The first check arrived right on time, the same way it had every month before it. The second one never came. When Tracy called to ask about it, Sandra answered with the same flat tone she'd used in that living room months earlier, explaining that the store's numbers had gotten tighter than expected, and the tuition payments would have to pause for a while. Tracy asked how much tighter, since the bill from the university was sitting in her inbox with a due date circled in red, and Sandra said only that things were complicated right now, and she'd figure something out soon. 3 weeks later, Kyle posted a photo online standing next to a brand new truck, the kind with a sticker price Tracy could roughly guess just from the trim package, captioned with something about finally upgrading. Tracy stared at that photo longer than she wanted to admit, doing the math in her head between a truck payment and a tuition bill that had apparently become too much for the family budget to handle. She didn't call to ask about it. She'd already learned what kind of answer she'd get. Instead, she went to the financial aid office and took out the maximum in student loans the school would allow, then picked up a job folding shirts at a clothing store in the mall 3 nights a week, and a second job answering phones at a campus call center on the weekends. Between classes, shifts, and the loan paperwork, there wasn't much time left for anything else, and Tracy told herself that was fine, that plenty of people worked their way through school without anyone's help. She skipped meals more than once that semester to save the cash for textbooks, learned which vending machines in the library took crumpled dollar bills, and started keeping her receipts in a shoebox under her bed just to track where every dollar went, a habit that would end up mattering far more than she realized at the time. She didn't tell her roommate any of it. She didn't tell anyone. When the dorm housing office sent a notice that her next payment was due within the week, and her loan disbursement hadn't cleared yet, Tracy swallowed her pride and called home one more time, asking if Sandra could front her $300, just to cover the gap until the loan money came through. There was a pause on the line before Sandra answered, long enough that Tracy almost thought the call had dropped. Sandra's answer came fast once it did arrive, almost rehearsed, saying she didn't have it to spare, and Tracy would need to figure out a way to manage on her own from here on out. Tracy reminded her this was the same family that had bought a brand new truck 3 weeks earlier, and Sandra's voice sharpened, telling her that wasn't any of her business anymore, since she'd already signed away her stake in how this family's money got spent. In the background of that call, Tracy heard Kyle's voice, loud and pleased with himself, telling someone about the new sound system he'd just had installed in the truck. Sandra didn't lower her voice to hide it. She didn't seem to notice it at all. Tracy stood in the dorm hallway with the phone against her ear, listening to her brother talk about speakers while she tried to figure out how she was going to make rent on her own bed. And something in her finally went quiet in a way that didn't feel like sadness anymore. She said okay, hung up, and didn't cry, even though some smaller version of herself from years ago might have expected to. That night, she went into her phone's settings and blocked her mother's number, then her brother's, deciding without much ceremony that she was done asking this family for anything ever again. What she didn't expect was that somewhere in that same house, one person had never agreed with any of it, had stayed quiet through every meeting and every signed page out of habit more than approval, and was about to show up in Tracy's life at the exact moment she needed someone to. One evening, a knock came at the door of Tracy's dorm room, the kind of soft, careful knock nobody makes when they're expected, and Tracy hadn't told a single person where she lived that semester. She opened the door to find Grandma Lois standing in the hallway. Howard's mother, a small woman in her 70s, with a cardigan buttoned wrong, and a tote bag clutched against her side like she'd walked there straight from the bus stop. Lois hadn't called ahead because Tracy's number wasn't blocked on her end, but Sandra had made it clear weeks earlier that visiting her granddaughter wasn't something the family was doing right now, and Lois had simply decided that wasn't a rule she planned on following. She didn't ask to come in to talk about Sandra, or Kyle, or any of what had happened in that living room months earlier. She just handed Tracy an envelope with a few folded bills inside, enough to cover groceries for a couple of weeks, and said she wasn't there to fix anything between anyone, only to make sure her granddaughter wasn't going hungry, while the rest of the family sorted out whatever they thought they were sorting out. Tracy tried to wave it off out of habit, the same habit that had kept her from calling anyone for help all semester. But Lois pressed the envelope into her hands and told her to stop being proud for one evening and let somebody help her. They sat on the edge of Tracy's bed for almost an hour, And it was there that Lois said something that changed the way Tracy understood everything that had happened. She said that a few months before he died, Howard had sat with her on her porch and told her he wasn't comfortable with how the store's future kept getting talked about, that he wanted both of his children to have an equal claim to what he'd built, and that he planned on getting the paperwork changed to reflect that as soon as he found the time. He never found the time. The accident took that choice away from him before he ever got the chance to act on it, and whatever decision came after that, sitting in that living room with Gerald Foss and a folder full of papers, had never come from Howard at all. Tracy asked, quietly, why nobody had ever mentioned this before. Not at the signing. Not once in all the months since. Lois said she hadn't known how to bring it up without sounding like she was picking sides in something that wasn't hers to referee, and that she regretted staying so quiet for as long as she had. It had come from Sandra. Alone. In the months after he was gone. Tracy sat with that for a long moment, turning it over, realizing the agreement she'd signed at 19 hadn't honored her father's wishes the way her mother claimed it had. It had erased them. Lois left that night without asking for anything in return. But something about that visit settled a different kind of resolve in Tracy. One that had nothing to do with her family, and everything to do with proving to herself she didn't need their permission to build something of her own. With the last portion of her student loan still sitting untouched in her account, and an idea she'd been turning over for months about a simple skincare line made from ingredients she could source and mix herself, Tracy made a decision that felt small at the time, but that she'd later point back to as the real beginning. She ordered her first batch of supplies and started selling small batches out of her dorm room, packaging orders on her bed between classes and shifts, teaching herself how to ship product, and answer customer questions from a folding table she'd bought secondhand. It started as little more than a way to bring in extra cash on the side. What Tracy didn't know yet was that this small, almost accidental decision would grow, over the next several years, into something that would force her entire family to turn around and look at her differently. Just as Tracy expected, the silence didn't last long. Less than a week later, Sandra showed up at Tracy's office unannounced, with Kyle trailing a step behind her, both of them dressed like they'd rehearsed how this visit was supposed to go. Sandra didn't apologize for anything that had been said at that dinner table. Instead, she opened with how family was supposed to take care of family, especially now that the store was barely holding on, and how it wouldn't kill Tracy to put some of that money back where it came from. Tracy asked her, plainly, whether any of that concern had been there 4 years ago, when she was skipping meals to afford textbooks, while Kyle drove off in a brand new truck. Sandra didn't have an answer for that, so she changed direction instead, saying the past was the past, and dwelling on old arguments wasn't going to fix anything happening right now. Kyle added that there were laws about adult children supporting aging parents, something he'd clearly read about online the night before, and that Tracy might want to talk to a lawyer before she found herself in real trouble for refusing. Tracy didn't raise her voice. She told them she'd already talked to a lawyer, years ago, in a living room with Gerald Foss, and a folder full of papers neither of them seemed to remember clearly enough. That signed agreement, the one that had once stripped her of any claim to this family's business, was the same document that now made it perfectly clear she owed them nothing going forward. In writing, with both their signatures on it. Sandra's face went pale. Kyle started to argue that things were different now, that circumstances had changed, and Tracy said calmly that circumstances changing didn't rewrite a contract either of them had been more than willing to enforce when it benefited them. She asked them to leave her office. And this time, there was no debate, no folder, no pen waiting on a table to make the decision for her. They left. And Tracy didn't walk them out, didn't watch from the window to see which direction they drove off in. She went back to her desk and kept working, the same way she had every day since that first batch of skincare products went out from her dorm room years earlier. Within the following months, the bank moved forward with foreclosure on the store's building, after missed payments stacked up too high to recover from, and Bennett Hardware closed its doors for good, sold off in pieces to cover what was owed, the sign with the family name on it taken down and never put back up by the new owners who turned the space into a different business entirely. Kyle ended up working the floor at a different hardware chain across town, taking orders from a manager younger than he was, the same kind of job he'd once been handed ownership of without ever having to earn it. Sandra, with no business left to lean on and no daughter willing to answer her calls, moved into a smaller apartment near the edge of Lancaster, selling off most of the furniture from the old house, because there wasn't room or money for it anymore. The financial cushion she'd spent years protecting, for Kyle gone along with everything else she'd built her decisions around. None of it came from anything Tracy did to them directly. It came from years of decisions they'd made on their own, decisions Tracy had simply stopped being available to soften the landing for. Tracy kept building her company, expanding into 2 new product lines and hiring her first full-time employees that same year, and kept her distance from all of it. She moved into a house of her own outside the city, far enough from Lancaster to feel like its own separate life, and kept Grandma Lois close, driving down once a month to take her to lunch or just sit on her porch the way Howard once had. Lois never asked Tracy to forgive anyone or patch things back together. She seemed to understand, better than anyone else in that family ever had, that some doors get closed for good reasons, and that closing them isn't always something that needs fixing. Before wrapping up today's story, I want to share something this one really brought up for me. What stayed with me most about Tracy's story wasn't the money, or the reveal at that dinner table. It was how long she carried the weight of being overlooked before she finally stopped, waiting for her family to notice her on their own. A lot of people stay in situations like that far longer than they should, hoping things will eventually balance out if they just keep being patient. Sometimes they do. Often, they don't. And the only person who ends up changing anything is the one who decides to stop waiting and start building something for themselves instead. So here's a question for you. If you were in Tracy's position, would you have walked away from that family the moment you signed that paper? Or would you have given them another chance the way she did? Years later, at that dinner table. There's no single right answer here, and I'd genuinely like to know how you see it. If you've got a different take, or you would have handled any part of this differently, drop it in the comments below. Thank you for watching this story all the way through, and I'll see you in the next one.